The rain had been falling for hours, steady and cold, the kind that cuts through denim and skin like it carries memory. In the middle of that storm, down a long dirt road that most folks had forgotten existed, a girl no older than 10 crouched beneath a dying oak tree. Her arms, thin but determined, were wrapped tight around a shivering bundle. Her younger brother, barely 6, his face buried in her chest. She whispered to him through chattering teeth, not to comfort herself, but to keep him calm. No parent was coming, no wagon in sight, just the storm, the dark, and a silence that sounded far too much like abandonment. From the edge of his porch, Thomas Whitlow, a rancher known more for his solitude than his mercy, watched the scene unfold like something out of memory he'd spent years trying to forget. He didn't know the children, didn't ask where they came from, but something about the girl's posture, the way she became a shield in a world that had left her with nothing but a body to block the rain, it hit him hard, deep in the place where old pain sleeps. He saw more than 2 soaked kids. He saw a vow being kept by someone who had no business knowing what that even meant. Without a word, he walked out into the rain. His boots sank into the mud with slow, heavy steps. The girl looked up, not afraid, just exhausted, as if this were the last thing she'd ever have the strength to lift her eyes for. Thomas took off his coat and wrapped it around them both. The boy whimpered. The girl didn't flinch. She just pulled the fabric tighter, not knowing if it was kindness or danger, only that it was warmer than the wind. He didn't speak until they were on his porch. "You'll stay tonight," he muttered, voice like gravel soaked in regret. "We'll figure the rest out come morning." And just like that, the storm that had raged outside for hours found its match, not in force, but in grace. Not in thunder, but in a man who had once turned his back on the world, now choosing to let the broken back in. What unfolded beyond that night would go on to change more than just the lives of 2 orphan children. It would awaken something long buried in that old rancher. The truth that sometimes the smallest hands can hold the greatest strength, and that love, when offered without condition, can rebuild even the most weathered of homes. The cabin was small, 1 room, a stone hearth, a single bed, and a patched-up rocking chair that creaked even when no one sat in it. Thomas hadn't shared it with anyone in over 15 years. The last time he'd made extra space was the night his wife passed, and the room went cold, not from the weather, but from loss. But that night, after placing dry blankets around the siblings and stirring the fire back to life, he felt something in the room shift. It wasn't warmth exactly, more like presence. Fragile, foreign, and needed. The girl's name was Clara, and she didn't give it easily. Only after checking 3 times that her brother, Simon, was safe, fed, and asleep by the hearth did she whisper it to Thomas in a voice barely above the crackle of the wood. She never asked for help, never begged for pity, just sat upright, her back straight like someone much older, watching every movement he made like she was still waiting for the world to take what little she had left. That kind of trust isn't broken, it's built, and Thomas knew he had a long road ahead. He didn't press for answers that night. Didn't ask where they'd come from, or what had left them alone on a road with no end. Instead, he made extra porridge, laid another log on the fire, and handed Clara his only spare blanket, the one he used on the coldest nights. She took it without thanks, not from rudeness, but from a life that had taught her gratitude wasn't always safe to show. Still, when she tucked it around Simon, she did so with care, as if even sorrow deserved gentleness. The next morning, Thomas rose before the sun and found Clara already outside, feeding the hens like she belonged there. She moved with quiet purpose, never asking where things were or what needed doing. Her small hands knew labor, and her eyes had already scanned the property with the cautious rhythm of someone used to staying ahead of trouble. When he stepped onto the porch, she didn't flinch. She just said, "Do you need the barn swept?" Thomas blinked, then nodded. Not because he needed it, but because she needed to offer something. By noon, Simon was laughing. He'd found an old tin whistle near the fence post and had been tooting it with wild, off-key joy that echoed across the valley. Clara watched from the edge of the porch, arms folded, lips almost curving into a smile. Almost. Thomas watched her watching him and realized something that caught him by surprise. He didn't mind the noise. In fact, after years of silence and wind, That clumsy whistle was the sweetest sound he'd heard since his wife's lullabies faded from the cabin walls. That week stretched longer than Thomas expected. He had offered them one night, maybe two, but by the sixth day, they were still there. And not just surviving, living. Clara had taken a chopping kindling without being asked. She mended a tear in Thomas's old coat with stitching so fine it looked new. Simon followed the ranch dog like a shadow, and each night he curled closer to the hearth, his small hands finally relaxing in sleep. The cabin, once still and cold, was filled now with soft footsteps, clinking dishes, and a warmth Thomas had long forgotten how to carry. One afternoon, as Thomas returned from the south pasture, he caught a glimpse of Clara standing in the barn, talking, not to a person, but to a horse. Her hand stroked its muzzle as she whispered words he couldn't hear. What struck him wasn't the scene itself, but the look in her eyes. She wasn't asking the horse for anything. She was offering something, comfort perhaps, or just the assurance that it wasn't alone. And Thomas felt a weight he hadn't named in years settle heavy on his chest. They had been alone too long. At supper that night, Clara finally told him. Their parents had been killed in a wagon accident. No one came to claim them. The town they ended up in passed them from hand to hand until no hands were left. So they walked. Clara led. Simon followed. Rain, dust, days without food. Nights full of strangers and silence. She told it without tears, without tremble, but Thomas felt every word like a nail in the spine. And when she was done, she didn't ask to stay. She just said, "We don't want to be a burden." Thomas leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowed against the firelight. "You're not." The words came out rough, unsure, like a man remembering how to speak kindness again. Clara didn't respond. But the next morning, Thomas found her making biscuits in his wife's old apron, and in that single act, he saw more grace than he'd known in years. Winter was approaching. The wind had shifted. Nights came sooner. But Thomas no longer dreaded the cold. Because inside that cabin, once hollowed by grief, two children had brought back the heat of something sacred, family rebuilt not by blood, but by choice. And he realized then, with the clarity only silence can bring, that maybe the roof he once built to keep the world out was always meant to shelter someone else in. The snow came in thick sheets that December, heavier than in any of the past 5 winters. Roads vanished under white silence. The world narrowed down to what you could reach with your boots and bare hands. For most folks in the valley, winter meant isolation. But for Thomas, Clara, and Simon, it meant something different this year. It meant closeness. Chores done shoulder to shoulder. Meals stretched together. Firewood stacked and high. Proud piles beside the porch. The ranch, once built for one, now thrived with 3. Inside the cabin, new rituals bloomed. Clara read aloud from an old book Thomas's wife had once kept. A worn volume of prairie stories and poems about long roads and steadfast love. Simon drew pictures by lamplight, crude stick horses, lopsided barns, and 3 smiling figures with exaggerated hats. He said the tallest was Thomas. "He looks mad," Clara teased one night. Thomas grunted, but didn't deny it. The truth was, the drawing softened him. They were a mirror to a man he didn't know he was becoming. One stormy evening, a knock came at the door, rare enough during summer, but in the heart of winter, unheard of. Thomas opened to find a neighbor from miles east, shivering and pale, his wagon broken, his horse lame. Without thinking, Thomas pulled him inside, made space near the fire, and motioned to Clara for blankets. She moved without hesitation. Simon brought the man tea. Later that night, as their guest slept, Thomas sat on the edge of his chair, watching the 2 children move with the grace and calm of people who had already lived through too much. He whispered to Clara then, barely audible beneath the fire's crackle, "You're not guests anymore. You belong here." Clara didn't look up, just stirred the soup gently, and said, "We know." That small exchange, so unceremonious, so quiet, felt like the final nail in the walls that once kept Thomas locked in his past. It wasn't an announcement. It was a recognition. A man, a girl, and a boy, not as strangers, but as people who chose each other when no one else had. By the time the storm passed, the cabin looked the same to anyone passing by, but everything inside had changed. The silence, once heavy with grief, now held the sound of wood being chopped, stories being shared, and a boy's off-key humming drifting up to the rafters. The ranch was still small, still lonely on a map, but inside its walls, something rare had taken root. A family not born, but built. And in the Old West, where most bonds were carved in blood or broken by loss, that was a miracle in itself. By the first thaw, Thomas had begun carving a new sign for the ranch. The old one, weather-worn and splintered, had hung crooked for years. But this one was different. He shaped it with care, each letter deliberate. When he finally hung it over the front gate, Clara and Simon stood beside him in the morning light. It read simply, Whitlow and Kin. No titles, no explanation, just truth etched in wood. The townsfolk noticed the change. At the general store, the blacksmith's wife asked Clara where she was living now. Clara answered plainly, with my family. No one questioned it. They had seen the shift. Thomas, once the man who passed through town like a ghost in denim, now stayed a few minutes longer. Spoke, asked about folks, even smiled once or twice. It was as if the children had reminded him that living wasn't just something you survived. It was something you chose to do day by day. Simon became the favorite of the church ladies. He was polite, bright-eyed, and full of questions that made grown men stammer. Clara, on the other hand, grew into herself with the quiet strength of prairie grass, always bending, never breaking. She didn't talk about the road anymore. She talked about spring calves, seed planting, and how much more work the East pasture needed. Her voice belonged there now, rooted, real. One Sunday, after a long day of fence repairs, Thomas handed Clara a leather pouch. Inside was a silver hairpin, not new, not fancy, but polished and preserved. It was hers, he said, meaning his wife. Clara stared at it, silent for a moment, then whispered, I'll take care of it. And in her voice, he heard something deeper than promise. He heard continuation. Life moving forward. Love carried on. As the days stretched into seasons, strangers still passed by the ranch. Some stopped for water, some for work. And those who stayed long enough would see a girl and boy working side by side with a gruff old man whose eyes had learned how to soften. They wouldn't know the whole story, where the children came from, or what Thomas had lost. But they'd feel it, in the way the barn door creaked open with welcome, in the scent of stew on the hearth, in the way the roof overhead didn't just shelter bodies, it held souls together. As summer stretched its golden fingers across the valley, the ranch came alive with color and motion. Wildflowers bloomed along the fence posts. Calves kicked up dust in the lower pasture. Laughter, once a stranger to the place, became common as Simon raced through the fields with the dog close at his heels. Clara, taller now and sun-browned from long hours under the sun, had taken over the garden her mother never got to plant. And Thomas, the man once known for his silence, had become the kind who lingered on the porch just to hear it all. One afternoon, a traveling photographer stopped by, offering portraits for $1. Most ranchers passed, but Thomas invited him in. He didn't smile when the photo was taken. That wasn't his way, but Clara did. And Simon grinned wide, missing teeth and all. Weeks later, when the photograph arrived in a cracked envelope, Thomas framed it and hung it above the hearth. It was the first new thing on those walls in over a decade, and it told the whole story without a single word. The land responded too. The crops yielded better than expected. The animals were calmer, steadier. The barn, once quiet and worn, now echoed with life. Thomas knew none of it was coincidence. There was a rhythm now, one Clara and Simon had helped create. A sense that life, when tended with love and patience, had a way of returning what was lost. Not in the same shape, never in the same shape, but in a way that was just as real. That season, Thomas began writing letters. To an old friend out in Kansas. To a brother he hadn't spoken to in over 20 years. He didn't explain much, just wrote about the ranch, the new hands he had, and how the days seemed shorter now that they were full. The responses came slowly, but they came. And with them, something Thomas hadn't expected, a future, a widening circle of connection. Proof that even in a life built from loss, you could still grow outward. One evening, Clara stood at the fence line watching the sunset, Simon asleep in the loft, the air thick with the scent of cut hay. Thomas joined her, hands rough from the day's work. She didn't turn when she spoke. You think it'll last? He looked at her, this girl who had once stood in the rain holding everything that mattered in her arms. I think it already has, he said. And in that stillness, they didn't need more. Because they both knew. Some homes are built with timber, others with trust. As autumn crept in again, the wind carried memories. The kind that snuck in through cracked windows and settled beside the fire. It was Clara who first noticed the changes in Thomas. The way he moved a bit slower, the pauses in his breath, the way he'd sometimes forget a name mid-sentence, then laugh it off. He was still strong, still sharp, but time had begun its quiet work. And Clara, now almost a woman, understood what that meant better than she wished she did. She took on more of the ranch herself, managed the books, oversaw the cattle schedules, even rode into town to negotiate feed prices with men twice her age. No one doubted her. She carried the Whitlow name with a steadiness that couldn't be argued. Simon, growing fast and full of questions, watched her every move. He no longer asked if they'd ever leave, because he knew they already belonged. One night, around the fire, Thomas handed Clara a box. Inside were deeds, old letters, a marriage certificate, and a locket with a faded photo of a woman smiling beside him. I won't be around forever, he said. But this place, it's yours now. You kept it alive when I couldn't. Clara didn't speak right away. She just held the locket, thumb brushing the glass, then said, We'll take care of it. Me and Simon. Always. And Thomas, for the first time in years, felt the kind of peace that doesn't come from solitude, but from continuity. The first frost came early that year. Horses huddled closer. Windows stayed fogged in the mornings. But inside the cabin, the fire never went out. Simon carved new shelves. Clara hung dried herbs above the stove. And Thomas sat in his chair by the window, wrapped in a quilt Clara had sewn from scraps of their old clothes. This house never felt like home, he murmured one morning, until the rain brought you two to my door. By then, the ranch no longer belonged to one man's sorrow. It had become something far greater. A story of survival turned into belonging. A place where an orphan girl's courage gave an old man back his heart. And in that quiet corner of the West, where the wind still told its own stories, the roof that once stood only for shelter now stood for something sacred. The moment a man opened his door, and the world changed forever. Winter settled in like an old friend, slow and steady. The snow came, but this time, the cabin didn't feel cold. There were extra quilts, the pantry was full, and laughter had become a familiar sound again. Clara's voice carried through the halls as she taught Simon to read by lamplight, each syllable marking progress not just in learning, but in healing. And Thomas, though his body grew weaker, watched them from his chair with a quiet reverence, like a man who had lived long enough to witness his redemption. By now, word of the Whitlow children had spread through neighboring towns. Travelers who once passed by, without notice, now stopped to ask if this was that ranch, the one where a man took in 2 orphans and ended up saving himself. Some stayed to work a day or two, hoping to catch a glimpse of the story. Others just came to listen. And Clara always made sure they left with warm food, dry boots, and the kind of welcome they never expected from strangers. Thomas began sleeping more. He'd rest in the afternoons, wrapped in sunlight that filtered through the window panes, a dog at his feet and Simon's drawings tucked near his side. On the coldest nights, Clara would sit by the fire and read aloud from his wife's old book, the same one that once soothed her when the world felt too heavy. Now, her voice held strength. Not the kind born from survival, but from purpose. She had become more than caretaker. She had become legacy. One night, after a snowfall thick enough to hush the world, Thomas asked Clara to sit with him. When you first came, he said, I thought I was giving you shelter, but it was the other way around. You gave me a reason to build again. Clara reached for his hand, rough, worn, and shaking now, and held it tightly. You didn't just give us a roof, she said. You gave us a name, a place to belong. In the glow of the fire, those words echoed like a prayer finally answered. And though neither said it aloud, they both knew the story had come full circle. A girl who once shielded her brother from the rain had found more than warmth. She had found home. And a rancher who had once locked himself away from love had opened his door just wide enough to let it back in. Not in grand declarations or heroic acts, but in biscuits shared, chores done side by side, and a single act of mercy that rippled across a lifetime. Thomas passed in his sleep during the first thaw, just as the ice began to drip from the eaves, and the birds returned to the edge of the pasture. Clara found him in his chair, quilt still tucked around his legs, hands folded, face peaceful. There was no struggle, no fear, just the kind of stillness that follows a life well finished. The kind that doesn't need last words because everything that mattered had already been lived. The funeral was quiet, just as Thomas would have wanted. No preacher, no long speeches, just Clara, Simon, and a handful of neighbors who had come to love the man who once never spoke. Clara read a letter Thomas had written months earlier, his only request, that they keep the ranch going, keep the doors open, and keep the fire warm for anyone who might need it. And so they did. Clara etched his name into a slab of river stone and placed it beneath the cedar tree. Beneath it, she carved the words. He opened his door and found his heart. Simon planted wildflowers around the grave that spring, bright, unruly, and full of color. The kind Thomas never would have chosen, but would have secretly liked. And every evening, as the sun dipped low and gold lit the fields, Clara would sit there for a few minutes, whispering updates into the wind, knowing somehow he still listened. Years passed. The ranch grew. Clara took in others, children who had nowhere to go, wanderers who had lost more than they could name, young mothers who needed time to breathe. She never called it charity. She called it continuing. And those who stayed long enough always asked about the man in the old photograph by the hearth. She'd smile, brush her fingers across the frame, and say, "He was the one who reminded us that roofs aren't just built for keeping rain out. They're built to let people in." And so the story lived on, not carved into monuments or written in books, but carried in every act of kindness that passed through those wooden gates. The West had known guns, gold, and glory. But here, in this quiet place with a cedar tree and a porch light always burning, it had found something far rarer, redemption by choice. And all of it began with a girl who refused to let her brother freeze, and a rancher who, against all odds, gave them his roof. The ranch eventually became known simply as the Whitlow Place. No one asked for an explanation. The name carried its own kind of gravity. Folks knew it as the land where no one was turned away, where a hot meal was always ready, and where every child who passed through its doors learned how to ride, read, and, most importantly, feel safe. It wasn't a formal orphanage. It wasn't a mission. It was a home, one built on a foundation far sturdier than wood and nails. Clara grew into a woman of quiet legend. Not flashy, not loud, but respected in a way most men in town only hope to be. She could mend a fence line, balance a ledger, and dry a child's tears without losing her calm. And Simon, now taller than her, still carried the same light that once warmed that little cabin floor. He rode out with supply wagons, returned with stories, and always came back to the ranch before nightfall. It was the one place in the world that never let him feel lost again. Visitors continued to arrive. Some stayed a night, some stayed for years. And each of them, regardless of age, color, past, or pain, left changed. Not because of a speech or sermon, but because of how they were received. With dignity, with warmth, with the kind of acceptance that didn't need to be earned. Clara never made promises. She simply gave people what Thomas once gave her, a place to rest, a roof that didn't just cover, but welcomed. One boy, maybe 13, once asked her why she never locked the front door. She just smiled and said, "Because someone left it open for me when they didn't have to." That same boy, years later, would come back as a grown man with children of his own and build a cabin on the western ridge, not far from the cedar tree. And so the circle widened, not by bloodlines, but by choices made in love. And if you listen closely, on quiet nights when the stars were bright and the wind was low, you could hear Simon playing that old tin whistle from the barn loft, the same one he found all those years ago. The notes weren't always in tune, but they carried a kind of joy that couldn't be faked, a joy born from being found and kept. And in the hush that followed, the ranch seemed to breathe along with it, a living memory of the moment when one man gave 2 children shelter, and they gave him back everything he thought he'd lost. By the time Clara grew gray around the temples, The ranch had become more than a refuge. It was a living testimony. It held the handprints of dozens of children, now grown and scattered across the frontier. Letters arrived regularly, some with news of weddings, others with the names of new babies. Each one addressed simply to Miss Clara, Whitlow Place. No title, no explanation, just trust that the words would find their way to the woman who had once opened her arms the same way that old rancher had opened his door. She never considered herself remarkable, but in every corner of that land, you could see her quiet mark, in the strong fences, the worn books, the way every guest was offered bread before questions. Even the animals, somehow, seemed to carry her calm. Stray dogs never barked at her. Horses lowered their heads when she passed. It was as if the land itself knew who she was, and who she had been shaped by. Simon, now a man in his 30s, took over most of the labor, but he still called her sis, with the same childlike affection he had whispered on their first night beneath the oak. When asked why he never left, he'd simply shrug and say, "This place held me when nothing else could." And in those words lived the legacy of Thomas Whitlow, a man whose pain once silenced him, but whose kindness gave birth to a whole new world. One afternoon, Clara stood by the cedar tree, eyes on the horizon, wind tugging at her dress. A new family had just arrived: mother, father, and a frightened little girl who clung to a frayed doll. Clara didn't speak right away. She simply opened the gate wider and nodded toward the house. The woman wept. The man tipped his hat, and the child, seeing Simon by the porch, smiled for the first time in days. Another story was beginning, just like there's once had. And so the cycle continued, not in fanfare, but in faithfulness. The West would remember outlaws and gold rushes, shootouts and saloons. But in one small stretch of prairie, it would remember something rarer: a girl who knelt in the rain to shield her brother, a rancher who gave them his roof, and a legacy not built in noise, but in love that stayed. Some stories don't end, they echo. They linger in the cracks of wooden porches, in the scent of bread baking before sunrise, in the hush of two arms wrapped around a child during a storm. The tale of Clara, Simon, and the rancher who gave them his roof isn't just about shelter. It's about what happens when one human chooses to care, even after life has taught them not to. It reminds us that sometimes the smallest gestures create the deepest roots. Thomas didn't change the world with speeches or revolutions. He changed it by saying yes when it was easier to say nothing. He changed it by opening a door he thought was permanently closed, and by allowing two orphan souls to teach him how to feel again. That choice, quiet, unannounced, became the seed from which a whole new legacy bloomed. A reminder that love doesn't always roar. Sometimes it knocks once and waits to be let in. Clara's courage wasn't forged in grand moments. It was forged in holding her brother when no one else would, in stepping inside a stranger's cabin and offering more than she ever asked for. And Simon, the boy who once shivered beneath the rain, grew into a man whose laughter, resilience, and loyalty made that ranch more than just land. It made it alive. Together, they built something that laws and bloodlines never could: a family chosen, nurtured, and earned. So ask yourself, when the rain falls and someone is out there alone, will you be the one who walks past, or the one who opens the door? Will you be remembered for what you had, or for what you shared? Because sometimes the greatest legacies aren't marked by nameplates or money, but by how many lives found peace beneath your roof, even if it was just for one night. If this story touched something inside you, if it reminded you of what truly matters, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that speak in quiet, powerful ways. Like the video if it stirred your heart, and share your thoughts in the comments. Someone might be waiting to read the very words you've been holding back. Because kindness, like a roof, means the most when it's offered freely and remembered forever.